All right, good morning, everyone. This is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Draft Rule Information Session for small cities under 10,000 in population. My name is Madeline Phillips. I work as the Public Facilities Planner within the Department of Land Conservation and Development's Housing Division, and I'm here to help guide us all through some of the new rules that the department has been working on for the last couple of years, directed by a variety of legislative direction, and hopefully to provide you all with some clarity about what components of this rulemaking are relevant to cities under 10,000, and how to make the best use of the materials and content that's available because of this process. Just quickly, I'm joined here by several of our Department of Land Conservation and Development colleagues. I welcome folks to either drop your name in the chat with your positions, especially if you're regional representatives who represent particular regions, or if you hear some concerns from any particular comments in this session, please know that your regional representatives are listening, and they will be available to help you as the direct contacts for your communities to our team. You're also more than welcome to communicate with us directly as it makes sense to you. I'm also joined by my urbanization, capacity and urbanization colleague, Karen Guillen-Chapman, who will be joining me in presenting a couple of the slides towards the end of the presentation, or the latter half of the presentation. And she's also going to raise her hand and correct me where I make errors and mistakes as I present some of this material to you all. So let's get started, and from there we'll stop intermittently at certain points to field your questions as you may have them. First and foremost, we're here to share information about the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis and the process that we've been undertaking to develop administrative rules for that process. We'll review some of the concepts at a high level in this presentation, and we'll cite you to places where you might be able to read the draft, which is available right now, and we'll tell you about ways you can participate. The areas that we're covering today are administrative rules related to divisions 7, 8, 21, and 24. So colloquially, those are housing needs, urban reserve areas, and urban growth boundaries. Division 7 has to do with Metro, which I'm fairly certain folks on this call are not part of. And then we'll discuss questions from you all and review some of the opportunities that you'll have to provide public comment. Just as a quick agenda, I'll do a quick introduction here and provide some background on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, and then the majority of the presentation will focus on the draft rules and fielding questions from you all, and then we'll provide you with some more information about how to participate. Speaking of participation, public comment on these rules is open right now. It started on October 1 and will continue through November 7th. Of this year. To submit comments, you'll see an email up there, housing.dlcd@dlcd.oregon.gov, and a specific subject line, owner rulemaking 2025 draft rules for public comment, that assures that your comments get routed to the right place. And then secondly, and perhaps most pertinently, this week on Thursday, the 23rd at 1 p.m., Land Conservation and Development Commission will be considering these rules and holding a public hearing for the opportunity to hear comment from the public. Those draft rules are available on oregon.gov/LCD, and if you click on rulemaking, you'll get right to them. Now, just as a quick matter of course, there are some overarching elements we want to make sure that you're aware of. A lot of these rules are applicable mostly to cities that are over 10,000, though there is quite a bit of value in all of the materials and components that come with that come with the rules that are applicable to larger cities. The big overarching themes: housing is a challenge for cities of all sizes, especially the small ones. Larger cities have lots of tools and capacity to address some of their fair housing issues. Smaller cities sometimes find themselves bearing a lot of the pressure from the larger cities next to them or adjacent to them. And fair housing, therefore, is an issue in small cities too. We want to make sure that you have the opportunity or are at least aware of the resources that are prepared for larger cities, and hope that you all can look through those resources and apply what works and what could be helpful to you. And then finally, we also understand the department wants to focus on making it easier and helpful for you to make investments that produce desired outcomes. So addressing fair housing, meeting the housing allocation, your 20-year planning estimate, and potentially using targets, those shorter timelines, which are an eight-year estimate, which I'll get into later in the presentation, as a guide to address certain housing challenges in certain income brackets. Because you're beyond what cities have seen in recent past, which are population forecasts. Cities will now have the opportunity to see not just how many housing units they are likely to need, but all those housing numbers stratified by income level, which is something unique that we haven't seen in the past. Now, I'll run right into the rulemaking scope and provide an overview of some of the structure around the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. First of all, our rulemaking scope and the charge was to look at methods and assumptions to estimate capacity that cities have. You'll hear this over and over again to emphasize clarity and certainty in urban growth boundary amendments, exchanges, and reserves. There's a new process called development readiness, or to evaluate development readiness of lands. Those small cities are not obligated to do development ready land inventory work. Many small cities have inquired or found it advantageous to consider readiness when working through a buildable land inventory, or using development readiness as a filter for their buildable land inventory to understand where they might coordinate infrastructure investments to facilitate housing production. There are adoption-ready actions prepared for larger cities that may be applicable to smaller cities, not exclusive of model codes that are focused on affirmatively furthering fair housing, but those model codes have, we've heard from many small cities, been a really important tool that they might use to keep up with the pace at which legislation is changing the way cities do housing planning. There are a set of compliance pathways, though they're not applicable to small cities. These compliance pathways may provide a window into how larger cities are thinking about some of the bigger issues. And of course, the Department of Land Conservation and Development will be developing guidance to help guide Goal 10 work in particular, and Goal 14 work. So that's housing work and urban growth boundary amendments, exchanges, and the like. And that work will come after our rulemaking is completed. So you'll start hearing more about that in 2026 onward. Before I get into the content of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis work and the draft rule, please know that in 2023, the Land Conservation and Development Commission developed a racial equity framework for decision making, which considers a series of tools and areas of focus, of which are listed here on this slide. Staff have used this framework to ensure that we're addressing a variety of complex issues as we talk about changes to rules and interpretation of legislation. That has been an ongoing theme through our work, and it aims to center people of color in particular, and Black and Indigenous people of color, and folks who have typically been marginalized by the housing opportunities, and hoping to encourage making decisions to help ensure equitable outcomes for all folks, but in particular folks that have previously not been advantaged in housing choices in particular. Moving into the implementation timeline, you'll see on this chart that we've been working fairly diligently through our work plan, starting back in 2023 when House Bill 2001 was signed into law, and we are nearing the conclusion of this work now. You'll see that the things that continue are some of our online platforms, our methods, and we'll start to see housing assistance planning funding rolling out. So I hope folks on this call are keeping abreast of that and making sure they're tuned into the opportunities as they begin to emerge. To ground us first, before we get into the draft rules, is again the Goal 10 housing program. You'll see some enhancements as a result of some of the work that's been legislated in House Bill 2001 in the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis program. It's broken up into 3 categories or 3 segments: determining need, responses or local actions that respond to the need, and tracking and monitoring progress. Small cities are really going to focus on the determination of need and potentially, if there is a really great need, addressing housing capacity. So doing what cities in the past have lumped all together under a housing needs analysis, but now broken out into these 3 parts. But many of you may around housing capacity analysis, which includes a buildable land inventory for residential uses. So we'll spend a little bit of time through some of these slides talking about those steps in the process, and I'll try to highlight as I can applicability of some of this work. We'll run through first the contextualized housing need, the housing capacity analysis, and land use efficiency measures, which are helpful to cities of all sizes. Development readiness, which has become a fairly hot topic, knowing that ability of infrastructure are critical to the production of housing. Larger cities are likely to pursue a housing production strategy, but there are lots of cues that smaller cities can take from this work and the guidance that surrounds it. Of particular interest, the model code work that's ongoing could be very helpful and very advantageous to smaller cities that are understaffed or have some capacity concerns. And we won't really touch on housing acceleration, but we may mention that there are resources available as a result of the acceleration program. And again, you want to look at that yellow box, these yellow boxes throughout the presentation. I've tried to call out where there might be opportunities for smaller cities to consider. We also have, as I mentioned, a series of tools and resources related to housing work. And you'll see that listed here with model code, some guidebook work that we're going to do in 2026 to follow on to the rules that are adopted. There are a series of online tools, including a mapping tool that staff at DLCD are compiling, and that looks at assets and harms and helps cities address fair housing concerns. That data is available and will be available even for smaller cities, though it's not your obligation necessarily to use it because you're not on the housing production strategy schedule from the Land Conservation Development Commission. But again, these are tools that can help all cities address fair housing issues because fair housing issues exist in all cities. And then finally, there will be a series of production and equity indicator dashboards. You can keep up with what's going on in your region very directly without having to fumble through too many places to find it. And we hope to build a stronger state repository of strategies and tools. You'll see a matrix snapshot on the left-hand side of this slide that describes a series of challenges and responses. So how cities are going to move through their housing production strategy. We have this issue, we'd like to address it. Here's a way that that these tools and resources might be rolled out to meet that concern or need. I'll start with the contextualized housing need work. a concerted effort to bring forward a better understanding of local need for housing. Many of you are likely intimately familiar with your own community's housing needs. Some of you are trying to get a better handle on what the housing needs in your community are. And there are parts of the contextualized housing need rulemaking that can be helpful to cities that are small, even those under 10,000. First, the housing allocation I mentioned. Our work started with and will continue to work with a partnership of the Department of Administrative Services and Oregon Housing and Community Services to coordinate housing allocations and housing targets for all cities. For those cities that are larger, it's a mandatory effort. For those cities that are smaller, these are going to be opportunities for you all to see what your housing allocation is over the next 20 years. So that helps translate what has previously been the Portland State University population forecast. And then similarly, a housing target, which is a subset of the allocation identified as the next or near term 8 years. And those 8 years of housing need are stratified by income brackets. So you'll be able to see in much finer granularity the challenges to certain income groups to achieving or accessing housing in your community. That's a great guiding tool for cities that are smaller. It might also allow a small city to really hone its resources to the areas of housing need that have the greatest need potentially. So there's a great opportunity there for refining how cities that are smaller and have limited resources decide to use those resources and apply them to manifest or produce certain housing types in certain locations with certain characteristics. The capacity analysis is something that many cities are intimately familiar with because you've done a buildable land inventory. Maybe you've done a housing needs analysis in the past, but this is to determine that your city has enough land zoned to sufficient capacity within your growth boundary to accommodate 20 years of housing need. There are some components to the housing capacity analysis that are updated or will be updated upon adoption of the rules that we're discussing today. In particular, housing capacity analysis will include some safe harbor opportunities for inventorying partially vacant land. Though it may not have been as significant for smaller cities, we heard from local jurisdictions that inventorying land that is smaller in size or already has some existing development on it. So an example might be a 2-acre parcel with an existing home on it. That parcel has existing capacity or is not fully developed to urban density and potentially has some opportunity for further future development. That future development we consider partially vacant because it already has existing development, and the opportunity is here to provide a safe harbor for how to inventory those parcels. One way of which is the introduction of a land market supply factor, basically to acknowledge that not all of the land in a city's urban growth boundary in the 20-year planning horizon will develop. And in recognizing that, cities have the opportunity to discount the existing inventory capacity by a certain percentage to account for land that may be partially vacant and may not develop in the planning period. It's really hard to know sometimes on that 2-acre parcel example that I just mentioned. It's really hard to know whether or not that parcel will develop in the planning horizon. And we want to at least acknowledge that it's possible that that's not likely to happen, and provide some opportunity for cities to discount their buildable land inventory in that way. Further, we'll be offering some guidance on example methods, best practices, resources typical of buildable land inventory work that may help cities move through the capacity analysis more efficiently. Cities under 10,000 may be interested in doing a capacity analysis to get a sense of where you are in terms of your planning horizon and how much capacity the existing boundary has. And especially, cities have in the last few years been interested in doing buildable land inventory work to determine if there is a land need. I'll highlight that some of the requirements, the housing capacity analysis being one of them, is required in order for a city to move forward with an urban growth boundary amendment. So that is a relevant thing, though you're not on the schedule to do regular updates, like cities over 10,000, there is a requirement that cities perform a capacity analysis in order to show need for an action like an urban growth boundary amendment. Capacity analyses are designed to address sufficiency, to compare housing need to existing capacity. So if there is sufficiency, no further action is required, though cities may want to pursue land use efficiency measures, which I'll speak to in just a moment on the next slide. But if you find that you have insufficient land to meet your existing need, or in this case, your need as provided by your allocation or translated through those income brackets in the context of a housing target, you might find that you have insufficient land to provide for the next 20-year planning horizon. Rules must adopt measures to increase capacity for needed housing. So the two options are to pursue efficiency measures, do an urban growth boundary amendment, or both of them. And I'll describe a little bit more in detail how those two options proceed. First, land use efficiency measures are something that some of us might be intimately familiar with. Efficiency measures sometimes come in the form of increasing density or increasing opportunity. So allowing folks to build on more of a lot and decreasing setbacks, allowing construction to build higher to a higher height, may also allow for more efficiency of existing land. But the idea is to provide opportunity for cities to best use the land that's within their current boundary without expanding and accommodate more of the needed units that may be identified. So in this work, in the draft rules right now, we're clarifying how land use efficiency measures relate to some of the actions that cities take. So where you see housing production strategy, you might also insert a common term, a housing implementation plan, or similar, which blends a variety of different actions together that help produce housing, and also to identify a threshold as to when has a city done enough efficiency work. And we've got some parameters within the rules, namely an attainment of 20% greater density over the planning period, at which point a city has taken enough land use efficiency measures that it makes sense for them to continue forward and do both, which are efficiency measures and an urban growth boundary amendment. So all cities are encouraged to find ways to support housing through land use efficiency measures. It's not just for larger cities, and often there can be some great opportunities and outcomes from thinking through how some of the properties within your community could be better used. I'll stop there and see if there are any questions in the group. That was a big lift or a big start to the conversation, and I welcome questions and any other inquiries you might have to offer. Are there any small cities that are on the call today that are doing or are planning to do a buildable land inventory right now? Show of hands. Hi, Cresswell. Thanks for raising your hand. I'm glad to hear that. There are a number of folks that are likely to pursue buildable land inventories in the not so distant future. And we're hoping that by implementing some of the proposed rules that we're going to make that process a little bit more efficient and clarify some of the challenges that cities often run into related to that inventory process. Don, do you have a question?
No, I was just, I'm looking into the possibilities of doing that in the near future.
Wonderful, thank you. It's a big lift for a small city. It's also a really meaningful conversation starter to talk. Sorry about that. I seem to have just had a freeze moment. We better move on so before I get stuck in the internet mire. Thanks all for listening for that first component of the presentation. We're going to move into development ready land work. And after those slides, I think I'll turn it over to my colleague and you'll get another voice to listen to for a few more minutes after that. Development ready land is a new concept that was introduced by the legislature in 2023 with the understanding that the housing capacity analysis and buildable land inventory may not meaningfully respond to land needs for near-term housing development. And we hear all the time the 20-year horizon is not the same as the private land development horizon that folks may be interested in when they come into the counter and ask you for the opportunity, ask the opportunity to pursue a housing development. It sometimes puts cities on their heels talking about buildable land because buildable land may not truly be ready for development within that near term. And I think we're calling near term a 6-year or 8-year planning horizon. Development readiness has 3 definitions. So just to note, this picture is what I wanted to capture from this slide, that buildable land is a big idea and development readiness is a subset of those lands that are truly ready for near-term development. What's particularly important is to understand how the legislature has defined development readiness. So the land that is ready for development is annexed and zoned to allow for housing. It is readily served or identified in a CIP to be readily served within that short near-term planning horizon. In other words, it's likely to be available for someone to come to the counter and make an application and pursue a current planning application to develop something within the near term because it has utilities within proximity, or the community has made a promise via a capital improvement plan to provide those utilities within the planning horizon. So instead of this being a one-off, I guess in my local government experience, we did a lot of pre-application meetings and similar opportunities to probe, is this site ready for development? Is this site ready for development? In this case, cities are asked to do an evaluation of the whole city, what's in proximity to existing utilities and or will be ready within that shorter planning horizon. And importantly, not encumbered by potentially natural resources or other challenges that might inhibit entitlement of the land for near-term development. The tool, the development readiness definition, and the tool that could be very operative for smaller cities is the opportunity to target infrastructure investments to create readiness in areas where potentially you've had vacancy for a long period of time. And in doing so, we've created some rules around development readiness that help identify not only what development ready land means and unpack all of those terms that I just used, but also describe how development ready land will be quantified, and then also how specifically whether or not development ready land is of sufficient quantity to meet the city's near-term housing target. So remember, small cities will have access to a near-term housing target. They will not be obligated to meet it, but it will, in a lot of ways, it will help cities to refine and understand what their immediate need is, and in a lot of ways, potentially help elected officials in your community and other community members understand where exactly those challenges are, not where geographically, but where perhaps in the income spectrum, where in the types of housing spectrum those needs are, and potentially validate some of those concerns where in previous conversation it's a lot harder for a smaller city to validate whether or not those needs are real, whether they persist even after certain investments. And we hope that smaller cities, though they're not obligated to, will use some of these, use the target and the tools available to them to make that case and start making investments to produce housing that community members really need. I'll briefly describe some of the production strategy actions, just because this is optional for smaller cities, but it's something that might help inform your housing implementation planning or similar type activities. That the development ready land inventory and its intent are meant to feed into a set of actions that a city takes within the planning horizon to address some of the things that are within a city's control. So I noted earlier that land use efficiency measures are often a tool that cities can use to increase the development potential of land that's inside the city that could be served. There's also the opportunity to identify actions that address certain needs that your community has. In particular, those strategies, those all would be considered production strategies, and production strategies in those series of actions help help a city address some of the identified needs that they began with earlier in this graphic that you see on the screen. Oh. With that, I'll open it up just one more time for questions, and then we'll transition into the latter half of the presentation related to urbanization topics.
Okay, I'll give it maybe a minute or two. Good morning, buenos dias. I'm Karen Jijen Chapman. I serve as the Urban Growth Boundary Specialist at DLCD within their housing division. I thought I'd walk you through a little bit before we get to goal 14. Maddie had mentioned that we had a couple of pieces of legislation that I think, or the department really believes, there's several new resources coming out of the legislature, coming from our department to all cities across Oregon. But I think in particular, we want to highlight how smaller cities might use these resources. So the model code was published. I think there's a draft out there for public comment on the pieces, the modules of the model code, and kind of all the available versions of the model code for small cities, medium-sized cities, or large cities. And I believe the way that's broken down is small cities, the model code that was crafted for small cities are population 2,500 and under. So if you're a really small city, there's some model code that's specific to those small communities and those needs. Then there are model codes that are applicable to cities above 2,500 up to 25,000 in population. So they found that those mid to small size cities, those had very similar needs and had codes that could be very applicable as far as development standards across. And then the larger cities, they're all kind of lumped together. Any city above 25,000, there's model codes out there. And why the model codes? Well, you can adopt them by reference. They provide a comparative standard. You can look at your local code and say, okay, are we as permissive? Are we similar? Are we different? You can really evaluate why is our code different and does it make sense today in today's development environment? Does it make sense in our local context? And you can compare that to your housing need allocation. So what are the housing needs in my community divided up by income bracket? What do we know and how do we be more permissive about the housing types that we might be lacking in our community and where those large needs and those medium and smaller needs are. So if you have a large aging population and maybe they want to downsize in their housing or they want single floor housing, they may want smaller properties, they may want to live in closer communities. All of those things you can start to assess around your housing types and what your code allows locally. And then the compliance. So what are all this new pieces of legislation and what does it mean for my community? I think there's a couple pieces here. So the legislation around bills, I think it was House Bill 1564 created the requirement for DLCD to produce these model codes at those thresholds. The populations were specific in the legislation about which model codes for which site cities. And then there's just a lot of legislation to track and follow, and we may not all have sufficient capacity to keep up, the staff capacity locally to keep up with all the changing environment at the state level. So 2 years ago, Senate Bill 1537, or maybe a year ago, it was probably 2024, Senate Bill 1537 established a new office. It's called the Housing Accountability and Production Office. And as Maddie mentioned, many of the requirements for cities above 10,000 won't apply to you. So it's not really a regulatory office in that sense, unless for some reason your city is out of compliance with housing laws. And there's an inquiry put forth for the Housing Accountability and Production Office. But more so, the Housing Accountability, or HAPO as we call it, that office is really there to provide support with compliance housing laws. I need to understand what are the middle housing requirements in my city. I need to understand what are the affordable housing allowances per state law, and how do I apply that here in my community and with our current code, or what can I do with reference to statutes or any codes available to me that we can access. So that's, feel free to always contact HAPO if you have questions about housing law, if you want to just verify and check that you're working within compliance, or if you want to look for opportunities, tell me more about the model code. Could it be applicable and how would it be applicable in my local community? That's available to you. So I'll go into the next slide and we'll get just a little bit more specific here. So we have, if you want to look at the draft rules, you can find model code rules that will apply to cities in our Division 8, which is the housing statewide planning goal, is administered by the rules within Division 8. And then specifically Rule 420, you can look at what the model codes will provide for cities that want to look at their compliance and compare their codes with housing laws. You can look at ways that you can amend your local standards, or if you want to apply statute directly. And then there's always the option where applying local standards, if you need to apply by reference and you don't have the capacity to do a direct code update. So I think this is the beginning of the model code and what's available to cities. There will be additional modules that you can adopt, so you can always keep up with what HAPO is publishing and saying, hey, at my local community, it'd be really helpful to have a module or a chapter on this type of development codes and standards. And you can see what they're publishing and what might become available in the future. So I thought I would pause there as folks are thinking about, okay, so there's a model code that's available around housing and local land use regulations and development standards. What does that look like for me, or how do I comment on it? How do I review it? How do we contact HAPO, or what is HAPO available for as far as a resource for smaller cities? Anybody with us today that has contacted HAPO or sent an inquiry into HAPO recently? Not yet. Well, let's see. We got one hand up. Nice, Dustin. So hopefully down there in Southern Oregon, when you contacted HAPO, you found them as a resource that was able to provide you with information. Feel free to share if you'd like to, Dustin. You don't have to. Any other folks? All right, we'll check out the model code that is out there for small cities, even if you're a city between 2,500 and 25,000. Check out those modules in the model code, see what might be applicable to you. Any questions on recent housing laws and legislation, feel free to contact DLCD and HAPO can help you orient your local regulations to what's out there statewide with recent legislation. All right, so I'm going to move on. Several cities on the call today. Most of you are all familiar with urban growth boundaries. Some of the cities with us today have gone through UGB amendment processes and looked at their Goal 14 requirements and all the rules that apply there. So there's some new things in the proposed rules we wanted to walk you through. What we've always had in rule is establishing a preliminary study area and then a final study area that compares your alternative sub areas. Okay, where should we expand the UGB? We need to look at areas that we can remove from a preliminary study area, and that's usually around your natural resources and natural hazard constraints and understanding just what isn't feasible. If brought into a UGB, it wouldn't be annexed or it wouldn't be developed. And then understanding what impracticability to serve is. How do we exclude lands from the preliminary study area based on the fact that usually it's physical or topographical constraints of there's just no ability within the planning horizon, that 20-year planning period, to extend infrastructure out there, and kind of understanding that. We also have some new requirements that when you establish your study area, we have to remember that we're on ceded land. And this is area outside of your jurisdictional boundary you're assessing to bring into an urban growth boundary. And our tribal communities have interests in this area. So there's always been a requirement to contact your property owners at a certain phase of your UGB process. And now at the study area phase, you'll also be contacting the tribes. And there are resources of which tribes to contact with our Commission on Indian and Tribal Affairs. So you can contact the state of Oregon. And so there's rules on how to do the notification and the requirement for notification. And then in guidance, we'll have a lot of resources to help you support that notification. Let's see, our next slide we'll be looking at, so any of you that have done your Goal 14 work and use the administrative rules, this will be somewhat familiar. I'll bring in a reminder here. And for others, just understanding that there are, I think it's 4 location factors in Goal 14 that you sort of balance in assessing what is the best area or sub area for an urban growth, or a couple of sub areas for an urban growth boundary amendment. And you're balancing the location factors around efficient accommodation of your identified needs. So whether that's a housing need or a combination of housing and employment lands, you're looking at an orderly and economic provision of your public facilities. So where does it make more sense to extend our infrastructure, and where is it most cost effective and efficient to provide those urban level services to land newly added to a UGB. You're looking at the comparative, I think it's the SE analysis is what we call it enduringly, but the comparative of your environmental, your energy, your economic, and your social consequences, really looking at all those factors in selecting land. And then the compatibility of the land that you choose to bring into a UGB. What's nearby? What's the impact to the adjacent or nearby agricultural and forest activities that are happening on farmland and forest land that currently resides abutting the study area or lands that you're considering to bring into a UGB. And in doing this, there's a new provision in rule around, well, I've got land out there in the study area, but some of it might be rural residential exception land, and bringing that land in is of high priority. It makes sense for good urban form to bring in rural residential. It's a good candidate for being urbanized. But how much residential capacity could I assume to get out of that? Because I'm assuming there's going to be some infill development or some redevelopment, and that doesn't always play out in the market the way we'd like to plan for it. And so within rule, we propose a new discount that land that's parcelized at 5 acres or less, rural residential exception, that you can discount, or you should discount, the assumed capacity by 50%. And that kind of follows a trend that we've seen about rural residential exception that are brought into UGBs and some of the challenges and opportunities for redevelopment and infill. But it's about at 50% where you can assume, okay, I'm going to get some capacity, but maybe not a full capacity of lots that are larger, say 10 or 20 acre parcels coming in. So that's new to rules, and hopefully folks will find that in line with the experience they've had with UGB amendments and considering lands to be brought in. I think, and then there's another piece around understanding your public facilities plan and coordinating your public facilities plan and understanding what is the potential yield and cost to serve, understanding those costs around how land might be developed and the densities at which it could be developed, and what is the cost to bring that infrastructure, say a per unit cost, or understanding comparative one sub area to another, what may be the cost to extend those, and what is the capacity that's assumed on that land. So a couple new pieces in understanding your study area analysis and comparing sub areas around residential use and land brought into a UGB for that purpose. Our next slide, let's see, we're going to talk a little bit about UGB swaps. So I think a few cities around the state have done this recently. I think we've got a couple cities in the process of doing UGB swaps around the state. And I think it's really beneficial for communities who have had UGBs for a long period of time that haven't been amended recently. So if you're sitting with your originally acknowledged UGB, or you haven't had a UGB amendment in the last decade or 2 decades, there might be some land in there that you're kind of puzzled over, and like, why do we keep counting this as buildable land? I don't even understand why it's how it got into the UGB, but under today's environment and current statewide regulations, it just doesn't make any sense to urbanize this land. And so a lot of cities look at, well, what's available outside of the UGB that we could bring in? And what is the opportunity and feasibility of being able to swap out some acreage? A few cities had looked into this and ran into some barriers, and we thought we would address those barriers with some rule amendments. What came to us was, there's land within my UGB that might be designated residential, but it has a lot of different development impediments, and it may or may not be inventory is buildable. And if it's not buildable, we can't swap it out with little to no capacity and then swap something in that has any capacity or a greater capacity. And so within rule, we've provided the option that whether land is inventoried as buildable or not, whether land has impediments and very little capacity or not, or whether land is constrained, all 3 of those you may now swap out per the new rule amendments. And then when looking at land that you're bringing in, the second challenge was around, well, we may want to swap out land that we could have never used, and it was designated for, say, a low density. But it makes a lot more sense, this buildable land that we can bring in, we could bring it in at mid density or something higher than what we had, but the rules never allowed for that. And so new rules state that you must bring in land at least the same density, but you may bring it in at a higher density and higher capacity than what you swap out. So a little bit more flexibility there. And then a piece of clarification, the rules have always said that the swap needs to be substantially equivalent. And we weren't entirely sure what that meant. Is it substantially equivalent based on the amount of acreage? So if I'm swapping out 100 acres, I have to swap in within 10% of that, so 90 to 110 acres. Or substantially equivalent, does it mean capacity? If I have a capacity on this acreage for X amount of units, then whatever I swap in has to be designated or zoned at a similar density and similar capacity, so it's the same X amount of units. And we decided to simplify it that it's only determined by acres. You could, the way we wrote the rule is if there's any compelling reason that you want to do it by capacity, you could make that justification, but otherwise just by acres is certainly fine. So here's 10% margin. I'm swapping out the same amount of acres, substantially equivalent. And then just defining substantially equivalent. Not only is it, you can do it only by acres and choose just to show that the acreage is substantially equivalent, but understanding that substantially equivalent now has a meaning. It means 10% and that's the margin you get. So a little bit more flexibility and a little bit more clarity. And that's always kind of a goal if we can get both clarity and flexibility. It's a kind of a rare unicorn that we shoot for each time. Speaking of clarity and some new options here, our next slide, we're going to go into urban reserves. I cannot remember. You guys will have to tell me, raise your hand or put it in chat if any of you have an urban reserve. We have 15 urban reserves in the state. One of those 15 is for metro regional government. And I can't remember, Southern Oregon, I think there's a shared urban reserve, and some of you might be in that Southern Oregon urban reserve area. But let us know. A few folks might have them. So what's going on with rule amendments in urban reserves? We had a request to us, cities that had done an urban reserve or were contemplating an urban reserve mentioned to the department. We do an analysis to do a UGB amendment. We look at the study area and we look at all the land. And that analysis sort of mirrors the same analysis you ask us to do when looking at an urban reserve area. We look at kind of the area adjacent or nearby our UGB and do an analysis of what lands are available to us. It mirrors, and the language is very similar, but it's not the same. And because the language is different, is that intentional? Is it an oversight? Like, why can't the language be the same and the analysis be similar? And for the most part, what we found in comparing the rules and the methodology and the analysis is when you do an urban reserve, you're looking at 50 years out, what is potential for urbanizing land adjacent or nearby the UGB. And there's a high level of analysis that you're not going to really know cost of infrastructure and yield for residential land in the same way that you might within a 20-year planning period for urbanizable land or land that you're considering to be urbanizable and bring in the UGB. So there is a slightly different analysis, but that the analysis could really mirror itself in that you will look at first priority land, that land with the least valuable soil qualities. So land that's already been, say, exception land for whatever reason, maybe rural residential or some kind of commercial use or something's happening on the land that has an exception. When you're looking at marginal land, and those are very few in the state, or just looking at non-resource land. And so those high priority lands, and then the second category and third category, all of that could be really similar. And so you'll see in the draft rules where we try to sync up the language for land prioritization in Division 24. And you'll find that in Rule 67, paragraph 2, I think. So it'll be numbered to paragraph 2. And then you'll find it in Division 21, Rule 30, and that's paragraph 3. So numbered, they're number 3 under that rule. And in addition to kind of syncing up that language and making the analysis really mirror each other between the two when you're looking at land, we also decided to really specify around that prioritization that your non-resource land and your exception are going to come in first. But then what comes in next is that farmland, and there's lands that aren't high value. That kind of goes to your next category. And then distinguishing that within high value farmland, there's some subsets. So you've got your high value farmland under statute 195-300. You've got some very specific high value farmland under statute 215-710. And then last are your prime and unique soils, and those have a classification from 1 to 4, and you use that soil classification to determine which prime and unique soils come in first. And that your prime and unique soils are kind of your last priority or the highest value quality soils. And so those are last to come in when no other land will meet that need. So we specified that a little bit further. In the middle of our rulemaking this year, Senate Bill 1129 was passed, and it asked us to do a couple more things in the Division 21 specifically. So anybody looking for establishing an urban reserve, there's a few more options available. That within that priority one is our exception lands and our non-resource lands. And we mentioned that often that land is very parcelized. And so now you have an opportunity that land that presents with planned developments or subdivisions that are platted or are now a second priority or a bifurcated priority. So you have your priority one lands, those exception lands with no subdivisions and no developments. Those will always have a higher priority now than the ones with subdivisions. So where they all used to be equal in category one, now anything with a subdivision gets a lower priority, and you can kind of skip over that and say, oh, I'm going to go after this exception land over here without any subdivisions or platted developments. Another option that House Bill 1129 gave us, or is it Senate Bill? I can't remember. Looking at where urban services are not reasonable or cost effective. So within those priorities of exception lands and non-resource lands, your farmlands, your forest lands, then your high value, and then your prime and unique soils, as you're looking at each category of land, if for some reason it presents that your urban services and extension of infrastructure, bringing infrastructure out for whatever reason is just really not cost effective or reasonable for you, you can make that case and present findings and say, hey, this is land that we're going to skip over for lower priority land based on cost to bring urban services. So that's a new option that we hadn't previously been available in Division 21. The last piece that we added here are for those jurisdictions that have urban reserves or jurisdictions that establish their urban reserves, you'll kind of track that original urban reserve. So in the same way that you look at your originally acknowledged UGB and that land that you have available, you would look, okay, here's my original urban reserve area, and how much of that urban reserve have we brought into our UGB over time? And cities always have the option to replenish their urban reserve. That's a 50-year land supply beyond the 20-year planning period. And as you replenish it, you're going to understand and track, oh, this is our second generation. You know, we expanded it out here. This is the newer land we brought into our urban reserve. And in the proposed rules, it sets a threshold that 80% of the land in your original urban reserve must be brought into your UGB before you go after newer land farther out where your UGB might be amended or in a different area where your UGB, or I'm sorry, your urban reserve was expanded. And the purpose for that is the analysis done to create that first original urban reserve area is the land that was deemed most likely and most available, most efficient to urbanize beyond the urban growth boundary. And you want to use that land up before you go out after different lands that had been skipped over that first time around, or before any newer land in a second generation urban reserve area that might contain different or new farmlands. And so you want to use what you have with your urban reserve. And we use an analogy of, you know, you have your first pie and you dip your fork in it and you start consuming that pie, or lands consumed and brought into a UGB, and you want to eat 80% of that pie. You can go ahead and buy a second pie or third pie, but maybe don't start dipping your fork into that second or third pie and start eating those before finishing maybe 80%, the majority of your first pie. And so that was the intent with some of the urban reserve rules. There's some new options there. There's some clarification. And then there's some tracking requirements, understanding the land within an urban reserve. I feel like that was a lot. So we covered a lot of ground around UGBs, exchanges, and expansions, and urban reserve areas planning out beyond the 20-year planning period. I'm going to pause here, see what folks, if there's any comments, anything you guys are excited about, like, oh, well, that would have been great to have had 10 years ago. Glad it's coming. Or anything you guys are curious or concerned about, like, well, how's that going to work? That feels really new and different. So I'm going to open it up for some questions for folks. Let's see, a raise of hands. Do we have anybody from a Council of Governments with us today? We've had some new folks add and maybe a couple folks drop off. I see names, but I can't tell who's with us. No, Council of Governments. Oh, we've got Justin, Council of Governments. Okay. I'm very curious. I'm going to ask you, since you're not asking me any questions, you guys can think about any questions you have for us. But I have a question for you all. Particularly, I'll just put this question out there for Council of Governments, and you can answer in the chat, or you can chat with me, and we'll talk about this now. But I'm really curious, as you think about the rules, there's so many new things available for small cities, whether that's comparing your local codes to the model codes, whether that's new options and new clarity in doing BLI or housing capacity analysis. And then Maddie mentioned, there's options of doing what was it, a housing implementation plan, or like an HPS, and there's options of doing a development ready land inventory that didn't even exist a year ago. I'm just wondering, for Council of Governments, what do you find you need most, or what would be most valuable for the department to assist you in carrying out a lot of this work for your cities that you serve? Let's see. All right, so you all think about my question, so you can chat with me later. Annie, I see a question here. Let me see what I have. Land, should I reach out directly to Donna Hardin? I have a specific question regarding land in our city. Let's see. Land in your city that would be inventoried as buildable for a residential purpose? I would say ask Maddie or I. I would love to just have Dawn answer all my questions. That would be so great. But I think to save Dawn from the many, many questions she gets from her jurisdictions, John, if you have a question about buildable land for a residential use or purpose, please do ask Maddie or I. Dawn will correct us if we're wrong. That's Dawn's job, because if we don't get it right, she'll let us know. But please ask us a question. Let's see, Susan says they work with OCW COG. Maddie, help me. OCW?
I think it's Mid-Willamette Valley, or?
No, it's the Oregon Cascades West Council of Governments in Albany.
Albany. Okay.
Sorry about that. I thought you guys knew.
Sorry, I live in Salem. I should know. Sorry. Okay, this is great. I'm learning all sorts of new stuff. Developers. Okay. I have to be careful because I have my paid job here at DLCD, and then I have my volunteer unpaid job with a developer. So I volunteer on the board of a developer. Recruiting developers. I'm going to skip around here. John, please come to us with your question. You can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you. But I'm going to go with Susan's question right now. There's a statewide organization called Housing Oregon. And there's another statewide organization called Smart Growth Oregon. And Smart Growth is predominantly your for-profit, large corporate developers, national conglomerates to local regional groups. And Housing Oregon is primarily your nonprofit, mission-driven, affordable housing developers. And I think contacting either of those groups and sitting down with them, I think many, many developers are looking for jurisdictions that are open to their development types. What's the housing types you want in your community? You want some townhouses? You want some small scale apartments, 15 to 20 units? Do you want some larger workforce housing, maybe some agricultural farm worker housing? Those two organizations are the best place to say, hey, what is attractive to developers? What are their barriers to developing locally? And how do we get them out to my community? I will tell you, there are developers in every region of Oregon. They just need to hear how open to business, how welcoming your community is. And I think those developers will be looking at things like the model code. They're looking at things like your housing need allocation. What are the housing needs in your community, and what are you doing to meet those housing needs? Call us, talk to us as developers. They're very open to those conversations. So thanks for that question, Susan. Could you explain the rationale for the rule of the original urban reserves must be observed first? Okay, I'm going to do that. I have a child in first grade, and it seems like I do best when I try to explain it to my to my 6-year-old.
And
I'm gonna try this. I may fail entirely. But
could I put a point on it?
yeah.
And maybe it's the pie analogy that, but it seems like there's a reason that we're changing things, right? I mean, there's a reason we're changing UGBs at all, and there's been some change of circumstance. It seems pretty, I don't know, it seems very suspicious of local governments, frankly, right? Like that, wouldn't you assume that we have a good reason that we're trying to bring in another area to the UGB? I mean, you've got lots of tests already on why you would bring something into the UGB. Why would you have just sort of a blunt amount rule when you're doing the analysis anyway of, well, why is this area a better or, more worthy of being developed next?
Yeah, it's a valid question, and we've had this question often, and I apologize if I'm being too rudimentary or too, but as I try to explain some of my work to my kiddos, although I don't sit and talk at the dinner table about this, it is kind of like when you serve your child a meal at dinner time, say, and there's some French fries on the plate, and you go to a restaurant and they just fill the plate up with French fries, and there might be 2 chicken nuggets and then some veggies. My little kiddo is going to eat all the French fries, as many as he can, kind of fill up on that and get to the chicken maybe and like skip over the carrot sticks and all that. So the veggies on the plate are kind of like your rural residential exception land or exception land that's been developed. It makes a lot of sense to bring that land that is showing some level of urbanization into a UGB because that's the way cities are growing and we can incorporate that in. But we understand that, that good urban form, that this rural residential land has development on it. It makes a lot of sense to bring into the UGB and incorporate in future development. But we don't know what the yield is going to be there, that this could be very parcelized and we're just not going to get the capacity. We want the land to come into the UGB and you can estimate a lower capacity. Now you're looking at that land that's parcelized under 5 acres and you're discounting it by half of its capacity, 50%. But bring it into the UGB. Don't leave it hanging out there, never getting urbanized. So it's trying to get the vegetables to come in, consume those vegetables, and then have some French fries. And so the way we did it is you've got your urban reserve and there's maybe some flat farmland and you really want to bring that into the UGB because there's some yield you can get out of that. There's some capacity for development. And yes, absolutely bring in all the French fries, but take some vegetables with it. And urban reserves usually will have a combination of exception land and farmland, maybe some high value farmland. Who knows how high value it gets? I don't know that if urban reserves, some of them have some prime and unique soils, but really try to bring as much of that in before you go out for more land, that newer land. And that's going to have a mix of exception and farmland. And so you're trying to balance out, don't skip over the exception land solely because of yield. Start bringing things in that makes sense and really provide a good urban form. That's that's the justification and the rationale for that. So don't consume all the French fries and leave all the veggies on the plate, or don't go after all the flat farmland and leave the exception land or other types of land, non-resource land sitting out there.
And
all right,
Alex,
please.
It looks like Josh also added some comment in the chat. Alex, in the event that there's land in your urban reserves that doesn't make sense, there are ways to adjust that if needed. Just want to call that out. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I always forget that point. Thank you both, Josh and Maddie. Existing rules that we did not modify. Division 21 does address urban reserves being adjusted. So if for any reason we're like, it just, I don't know, it was a mistake. We shouldn't have brought that into our reserve. We got to get it out. That's still not.
Nice.
All right, I lost track. Maddie, I was going to go to John because I think we had John earlier, and then maybe you could help me track after that. John, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I am the city manager in Heppner, and what we have in Heppner is, like Dawn's familiar with what Heppner looks like, but Hepner's in a steep-sided canyon, and we have floodplain and floodway in our bottom ground that prevents a lot of puts a lot of constraints on development and some lands that are buildable. But we have lands, and this goes long before my time, that are within city limits that we have an R3 designation that allows for farm use. So we have lands within city limits that are basically range ground that the landowner runs cattle on periodically. And he really doesn't want to sell his land. And then we also have some lands that are the same landowner that are similar, same situation, that are in our urban growth boundary. So realistically, like I have probably 100 acres within our city limits that during his lifetime won't be developed, whereas I have some land within our urban growth boundary, but not within city limits, that landowner would like to develop. So I'm wondering how we address a situation like that where, you know, we have either a constrained land that is within both UGB and city limits, and how we do look into swaps on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept within the city limits already. That would be, you're right, that would be a specific case. I would say, you know, you've got 100 acres under property owner A, let's say. Some of those 100 acres have been annexed into the city. Other pieces of those 100 acres are sitting in your urban growth boundary, unincorporated, not annexed. Yes. And it really would be specific around, have you done any public works infrastructure out there? What does your public facilities plan look like? Doesn't sound like there's been any development, whether it's been incorporated or it hasn't. And then where is your UGB? We most likely would be very difficult to get the findings for why you would swap out any land that's in your city that is not abutting your UGB, that doesn't make sense with good urban form. So you don't want to leave like a donut hole. We're going to swap this out and it's got annexed land all around it. It's surrounded by, but I think it could happen. You would definitely be eligible for UGB swap. So what I want to say for everybody, if the rationale for a UGB swap is property owner willingness, this property owner is unwilling to develop, and this is how we know this information, and it's highly unlikely to develop within the planning period, that 20-year period. I think the new flexibility under UGB swaps is an option. I say that for everybody to look at it as an option. John, for you, I would say we would need to look at it on a case-by-case basis of what is annexed and what is not, what's eligible for swap and what's not. And then what do you swap in? Let's really think about what you have available to swap in. And let's look at your housing needs. So what does it look like if we swap this R3 land out? Are you left with enough R3 land? When we bring in, what do we need to bring in and what does it need to be designated at? So those are the last two pieces that are specific to you, and it will always be specific to every community. But the broader piece that John is asking about, if it's property owner, unwilling property owner, we have information that we can share of why we don't believe it will develop within the 20-year planning period. Go ahead and look at it. There's precedence. You would be the only city swapping out for those reasons.
I'll just add, John, as a note of consideration, is that the biggest wrinkle in your request or your scenario is the withdrawal from incorporated city limits and the tax implications that's going to have. When we talk about swapping land that's in a growth boundary for land that's not in a growth boundary, there's no tax implication. But when we talk about unincorporating a certain area and talking about basically seeding it back into the growth boundary, essentially, adjusting your city limits, there's a tax implication, meaning it leaves your jurisdiction and it becomes of the jurisdiction of the county. So that's a little bit trickier than a typical UGB land swap, land that's in the growth boundary for land that's beyond it.
Yeah, and that's a situation where, you know, undeveloped land in that situation, in this instance that, even though we're a small city and all tax money's good, I would be less concerned about losing, you know, the probably several $1,000s a year that we're getting on the undeveloped land versus the possibility of, you know, 40 buildable lots on land that could be incorporated in.
Certainly. Don, did you have something to add?
I did. Thanks, Maddie. Maddie Cotton. I'm wondering if something, we have quite a few situations like this throughout Eastern Oregon, and thank you, John, for bringing this up. Is this something, or I guess maybe I should be asking, and I should know this answer, and I apologize for not. Is this something that we as an agency could support buildable lands inventories for some of these smaller communities so that we could specifically take a look at those properties that are outside the urban growth boundary and look at some potential for swaps? Because we have a lot of old farmers in my region that exactly what John described is what we're dealing with.
Yeah, Don, that's a good point. I think last biennium, we funded several swaps, and you don't have to redo your BLI. You can use your acknowledged HCA and the BLI with it, or your acknowledged housing needs analysis and the BLI within it. A lot of jurisdictions are opting to redo or reevaluate their housing capacity analysis. So we can fund any piece of that. We can fund the HCA with the BLI, so you have an updated housing needs analysis and understanding the land within your urban growth boundary, and or we can fund a UGB swap. So we've been doing that. I can't remember this biennium how many we might have under those two categories, but yes, Don, we'd be willing to fund that. Maddie, did I miss anything on that? I always missed 1 or 2 points.
No, that good point, and thanks for highlighting it. I think there's a, you know, I think, John, you cited your willingness to consider and show the economics of that transaction, and I think there is some merit to formalizing that in a way prior to moving forward with the decision. I think that helps all the decision makers be on board with the outcome.
Maddie, I'm going to take Scott's question if you want to read through Michelle's, and we'll cue that one up. Are you subject to owner requirements if you're already in the process? Okay. So what happened is House Bill 2001 directed the rulemaking under OHNA. So you've got all these new rule amendments in Division 8, 21, 24. It also, House Bill 2001 was amended by House Bill 2889. And 2889 states that if you have housing planning work underway, and you can complete that housing planning work by January 2027. Any city that's considering housing planning work and feels that they can complete it by January 2027, and that's entirely, like, are you doing an analysis on your housing needs? Are you doing a buildable lands inventory? Are you doing any housing implementation program? Are you going to adopt any efficiency measures? Do you think you might need a UGB? And all of this is relating to the original analysis. You got to get through all those residential analysis and housing pieces by January 1st, 2027. But if you've started some work and you have a compelling reason that, hey, these rules came in the midst of my work, or these rules were a surprise to our jurisdiction for whatever reason, you can make the case to our commission, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, and you will be given an extension to be vested in the existing rules today. Before any owner rulemaking, before any new rules are adopted, you can be vested in the old rules up until January 1st, 2027. So Scott, if there's work underway, that makes a compelling case of why we don't want the new rules to apply to our work. But we have to wrap everything up. It needs to be adopted locally, and everything needs to be acknowledged before January 1st, 2027. If you can do that, you may stay vested in the old rules. Anybody who's embarking on new rules, if you're sitting with me hearing this presentation today, it's probably going to be a hard justification to make. We were surprised. We didn't know the rules were coming. We already had work on, it would be really hard to make a justification to commission why you need the old rules extended to you through 2026 up until January 1st, 2027. So for the rest of us who maybe don't get to claim that we're surprised by the rules, or the rules are a departure from work that we've already been doing, these new rules become effective in a few months. They become effective January 1st, 2026, and we'll all be operating under the new rules of how you do a housing capacity analysis, which looks different than how you've been doing your housing needs analysis. I think for the most part, it provides you more flexibility and a few new options under housing capacity analysis. We were very responsive to what cities said they wanted to see in the new rules. All right, Ethan, LCDC 2027 deadline.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point here for folks who are considering doing something related to housing, right? What Karin is describing in terms of the January 1st, 2027, kind of, I don't know, you turn off one switch and you turn on the other one at that day. But I think what's important to note that becomes really important, particularly in the context of a local government doing a buildable lands inventory, a housing capacity analysis, and relying upon that as the foundational basis of a UGB amendment. That's really where that really is, particularly for this group, is really going to be an important point. But I also wanted to kind of separate that from a local government who's just interested in making that assessment of what their housing need is and applying some policy intervention to that, that is outside of the UGB process. So things like a housing implementation plan that's doing this assessment of a buildable lands inventory, like those kind of things are on a timeline such that a local government could reasonably get through that process before the kind of lights go out on the old paradigm. So I just wanted to kind of separate that out and say, like, don't pause on housing work just to wait for that January 27 deadline. But if you're considering the full process of assessing your housing needs and taking UGB amendment actions, that's a timeline definitely to be aware of. So thanks for letting me jump in there, Karin. Appreciate it.
Super helpful. Thank you. Patty, can we go to you and Michelle?
Yeah, Michelle's question, and Michelle, if you feel like you'd like to give voice to it, please interrupt me. But I think the crux of the question is, do the new housing laws allow a city to apply or an applicant to apply a larger density without the applicant being required to file for a zoning map change? So she talked about the maximum density allowed in a zone for single unit development, and a desire to potentially exceed that in the context of smaller cities, in which the requirements may not apply. Michelle, did I get that question right? I think you're hoping to see the opportunity to bring in property, bring in a subdivision that may exceed the zone's existing density cap. Did I get that? Correct.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, that they had a 5.7 and our max in the R1 is 1 to 6. So they want to apply for more of a single family dwelling attached townhome and be able to use that, but they're already at their max in the R1. So they've been repeating Senate bills to me, but most of those are ones that apply to larger areas. So my question is, can I go through and allow a higher density than what our current comprehensive plan and our current development code allow based upon the law changes that we've made this year? Or what do I need to do to try to make that happen if possible?
Great question. So I'll start, Michelle, with the question, is Harrisburg over 2,500 in population?
Is it what?
Over 2,500 people.
It's actually at 3,700.
Okay. So the one thing that you could rely on is work that just came out of the recent session, so fresh off the books in 2025. It's House Bill 2138, and 2138 identified that cities over 2,500 in population have to allow at least a duplex, where previously maybe only single unit dwellings were allowed. So that may, in and of itself, resolve some of the question that Hayden has or the applicant has. This is a great example of where you may be able to receive some great support from the Housing Accountability and Production Office, because they'll look at your development code and the density restrictions that may be present there and apply or be able to cite the laws now adopted bills or bills signed into law that might apply to your jurisdiction, and where your jurisdiction is potentially not up to date with some of the legislation that's been issued since maybe the last time you did your development code review. They'll be able to recommend, first of all, the application of statute. So statute can override local development code in certain applications. And then secondly, they'll be able to show or cite certain areas potentially of the model code, where the model code could be used in the interim while you're transitioning or addressing that question about zoning density caps, for example. They could also help you make a plan for how to proceed with this application, or potentially how you might proceed with amending your development code for future applications. So I'll make a plug here for the Housing Accountability and Production Office. They have a link that we can provide to you in our in the materials that we send after this meeting, that allows cities to make inquiries directly to them, and then they have a whole process of responding to those inquiries. So great question, Michelle. Thanks for asking it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions out there on the call at the moment? We've got about a half hour left if anyone has additional questions and comments or concerns. Thanks, Karin, for including the inquiry link for HAPO there in the chat.
And I see Dawn here. Yes, we'll send out the slides. You'll get a link to the recording so you can share with others in your office or others in your community. And then, yes, in the chat, you got the webpage. Should you have any questions around recent housing laws and how you work. See, if we pass the January 2027 deadline, what would be the implication of that for our UGB amendment process? So similar to what Ethan mentioned earlier, you have new rules coming into effect January 2026. You can use those new rules. It's just a few months away. Or if you want to vest yourself in the rules that are on the books today, you got to get it done. If you pass that January 2027 deadline, any work done under the old rules out of compliance with new owner rules, that analysis cannot be used to amend your urban growth boundary. You now have analysis that's out of compliance. Any other thoughts on that from DLCD?
Yeah, just a note that a city would open themselves up to pretty substantial appeal risk in that situation. The mostly just because I would, you could characterize that as like the scaffolding upon which that analysis is structured is no longer valid or usable in that context on January 2nd of 2027, or I guess January 1st, 2027. So I think that it would be highly advisable to not kind of straddle that deadline in that process.
It's undertaking a large risk, and should you get challenged, every T and every I will be looked at for crossing and dotting. All right, good questions though, because this is helpful for everybody. What do I do with my housing planning work now under the current rules? What's in the current rules? I need to understand what's coming in the new rules. Is there any compelling reason to be vested under the old rules today? Or in a few months, we'll have these new rules with the new options and clarity that we just shared with you all. So good for folks to hear from Scott and weigh this for themselves. And great question today from Michelle about how to use the HAPO office. I've got developers asking for things and I'm not sure what the latest legislation requires of my jurisdictions or what options I have in my jurisdiction.
Yeah, just a note on your item or your note there, Michelle, so the platform, and we've run in this in a different situation this today already, but the platform that form uses through HAPO is currently down. That website is currently offline at the moment. I think they're dealing with a bug. So yeah, today of all days, right? Of course. So apologies for that, but hopefully the folks over there at that other place can get it up and running soon. But I know that it sounds like there's some other things happening across the internet in terms of outages. So I don't know what's up with that.
Oh, that's good to know. I forgot about that. I didn't realize it went. This makes sense now. I'm putting 2 and 2 together. Yes, we've been having some technical difficulty with our online cloud-based functions, and it makes sense that this. So Michelle, what we can do is Patrick, between you and HAPO, we'll let folks know that Michelle has a question that she couldn't interface today, and maybe we'll ping you, Michelle, once we get up and running. All right. Yes, the
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll put that on ourselves to ping you once we're back up and running for inquiries or submitting inquiries. It just goes to show that everything ultimately is run by humans and human error happens. And even if we try to run everything by AI, when the servers go down, they go down, and AI can't do anything about that either. Any other inquiries, or maybe we'll put up that last slide, Maddie. Just because I want folks, we shared a lot of information today, and I want folks to know as they're looking at the rules, you'll see it, Oregon.gov LCD. Please, we'll send you out the slides, we'll send you out information, but we've got the rules open for public comment until November 7th, so please take a look, let us know what you think. We'll send out the slide deck so you can look at the rules with the slide and say, okay, what does this rule actually say, or what's in this division? You've got some dates there if you want to follow along on what's happening. December 4th through 5th will be adoption of the rules by our commission. And then if anything comes up, if you think of something similar to the questions, please send them our way. We're happy to think through those questions with you. Any other closing remarks that we want to share? Anybody else want to say something before we all head out?
Karen, I'd just add that, first of all, thanks everyone for being here. It takes a lot to make an hour or more in everyone's schedule on a Monday. We're very appreciative of your attention and interest in some of the rulemaking work that we've taken on. And though we understand that some of those rules, because of the way the legislation was written, don't necessarily apply to small cities, small cities still have a lot of the same challenges that large cities have. They just don't have all the tools or all the depth and capacity to address them. So we're here to help strategize how to address some of your challenges, work through them as best we can. I really appreciated that the regional reps who are on the call today have put a lot of their contact information in the chat. If you don't know who your rep is, please reach out and we'll make sure that you're connected with that person. And we're hopefully just providing a number of resources that will help cities navigate some of their housing challenges, both in code work and some of the legislative impacts that code work or legislative impact will have on code items, and then also to address some of those pressing questions. We've had land in our growth boundary for decades since acknowledgement, and we just don't know what to do about it. Help us brainstorm or think through what our options are. How do we get rid of or reduce the amount of phantom capacity we have? How much land do we really need for housing production? What kinds of housing might we be interested in encouraging, or how might we strategize how to encourage certain types of housing we really haven't seen in our community before, but we know is working in other places around the state, and we want to bring it here. how do we address growth boundary issues? We've had the same growth boundary for 40 years and we're just not seeing any movement from properties that are adjacent. We'd like to consider ways to encourage annexation of property, to encourage short-term housing development opportunities. There's a range of issues and challenges that cities are facing, and isolating or winnowing down what the issues are for your community and what are the steps that a small city can reasonably undertake in order to encourage a shift or a change in the circumstance is what we're here to help you figure out. So please reach out to your regional rep, reach out to us, Kata and myself, email the housing@dlcd@dlc.oregon.gov email address. That's if it's an inquiry that's not related to rulemaking, we're able to answer that question generally as well. So don't feel restricted to just rulemaking comments at that email address. That email address is open. And then I did mention a little earlier that the Housing Accountability and Production Office has a great depth of resource related to how to speak to those development code to legislation language and how do those pieces match up. And I think finally, the perhaps one of the biggest opportunities is the model code and how to compare your development code to the model and see, are we similar? Are we missing some opportunities because we're too restrictive on certain things? Are there ways to open it up so that we see more production opportunity or greater latitude for certain kinds of development that our community wants? So those are just all little bits and pieces that we're trying to nibble at to see what's the thing that's going to help a community take the next step in addressing housing need. I don't know if anyone else has comments you'd like to offer, but we're just very appreciative of your time today and your attentiveness and your willingness to reach out to us when you have questions.
All right, thank you all. Regional reps, if you get a bunch of inquiries after today's presentation, holler, we're here. All right, thanks y'all. Have a good
Thanks everyone.
afternoon almost.
Have a great Monday.
Thanks, everybody.